Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. Adolf Hitler hated modern art. At 18, he thought he'd set those idiots straight when he was admitted to the Academy of Fine Arts Vienna, where some of those degenerate artists were doing that ridiculous work. You know, show them that their colors weren't right, or their proportions were off, or they had to stop tinkering with images of what was real, and what the hell was Cubism anyway? He hated all of those experimental artists. Pablo Picasso, Henri Matisse, Wassily Kandinsky. Why would anyone think that non-representational scribbling counted as art? He'd prefer they paint houses, better use of the paint in any case, than slopping it on canvases and calling them paintings that, he said, quote, cannot be understood in themselves but need some pretentious instruction book to justify their existence, end quote. But he was rejected by the Art Academy and turned to politics instead. His histrionics and his jingoistic racism worked to change Germany, and by 1933, he could get his revenge on everyone he wanted. Because that's what weak, petty, disgusting people do when they get in positions of power. They plot revenge. The new age of art, those painters whom the Academy deemed worthy while he was not, well, they would more than have their turn being ravaged by him. He openly and repeatedly called abstract art insane. Most everything modern he termed subversive. From a documentary called Raiders of the Lost Art.
Modern art was declared an enemy of the state and culminated in the Entartete Kunst, or so-called degenerate art exhibition of 1937.
After staging that show of the objectionable art, all of it seized in the 4 years since Hitler had come to power, he informed the public that this art would never again be allowed to be seen, shown, or legally owned in Germany. And thus began the greatest art heist the world would ever know. Which is not to imply, of course, that the man's other crimes were on the same footing. 50 million lives were lost during World War II, after all. But this other, less discussed crime is at least worth acknowledgement. So this episode is about Hitler's attempt to hoard every last piece of great European art ever produced, while he was simultaneously and systematically effecting a genocide of Europe's Jewish population. Anyone who was a Freemason or a so-called gypsy or gay or a communist or an ally to any of the groups he decided were objectionable. After the war, when the vast majority of the works that had been taken from museums, galleries, and private homes had been found hidden away in salt mines, copper mines, abandoned jails, medieval castles, a hunting lodge or two, country homes, in barns, and on trains and crates, the total theft would reach more than 5 million works of art, sculpture, religious relic, stained glass, tapestry, furniture, and manuscript. A lot of it very valuable, but some not so much. As much as was possible was returned to its rightful owners. Even the German art that had been taken from German cathedrals and museums, for whatever reason, would be repatriated to the country from which it had been stolen. That was what the Allies said. It all goes back. Make it 1932 again. Now, for the record, stolen is the only word that works here. Even if the goods were sold at fire sale prices before the Nazi threat to Jewish lives became clear, or if they'd been traded in exchange for exit papers, or if they had been moved for safekeeping into the hands of Christian friends or bank vaults, they were stolen from rightful owners, museums, or the great Parisian galleries that sold art to the rest of the world. Hitler's obsession with possessing the most magnificent art that man had ever produced equaled his obsession to purify the Aryan race and dominate the world. Germans, he proclaimed, deserved it. Or, to be more specific, he deserved it. His intent was to place all of those Michelangelos, Rembrandts, and Da Vincis into a massive Führer museum he planned to build in Linz, Austria, the town he claimed as home, an Alpine city he had made elaborate plans to reshape so that, as he said, Paris would become a mere shadow of its grandeur. It would house, as Hector Feliciano wrote in The Lost Museum, quote, the most important European works from prehistoric times to the present day, end quote. To do that, his hall included 650,000 extremely notable paintings by name artists. Add those to the thousands of other artifacts, and you got a bit of a logistical burden, as it all would eventually weigh more than 40 tons. Which means a lot of war work was not put in doing war stuff. It was put into hauling marble statues from far-off cathedrals and to salt caves in the Alps. Hitler thought it was that important. As one expert remarked, quote, the plan to steal was inextricably linked to the plans for conquest, end quote. Former U.S. diplomat Stuart Eisenstadt in a DW documentary.
The Holocaust was not only the greatest genocide in history, 6 million Jews and millions of others, it was the greatest theft in history. And the Third Reich didn't steal all these artworks and cultural objects and books and instruments just to get more money for the Reich. That was a part of it, but that wasn't it. It was that this was a part and parcel of the genocide. It was cultural genocide. It was to eliminate everything connected to Jewish culture, Jewish ownership, root and branch. And many of the artworks that we're talking about, when the press gets it okay, they read about the masterpieces. But most of the art that was looted had much more sentimental and family value than it did value on the open market.
So how did the Nazis do that? Well, methodically, and with a ton of documentation because they were, of course, Nazis. And by making sure that millions were dead and an entire continent destroyed, so they could be considered the master race and admired because they were world-class consumers of humanity's finest creations. Leonard Malamud, a doctor with the 11th Armored Division of the U.S. Army, was on hand when some of the art was found near the end of the war, shuddered decades later at the irony.
All of this accumulated beauty had been stolen by the most murderous thieves that ever existed on the surface of the earth. How they could retain the nicety of appreciation of great art and be exterminating millions of people nearby in concentration camps, I couldn't understand then, and I can't understand it today.
If we're asking about their morality, there are no reasons that explain their behavior. If we're asking about the logistics of such a plundering, that can be unraveled as a crime that took 12 years to pull off, and is still, 80 years later, trying to be put right. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Smalls. My new-to-me cat, Sister Betty Lou, is a huge fan of this sponsor. She can be a picky eater, but the pep that Smalls cat food puts in her step is something to behold. Smalls cat food is protein-packed recipes made with preservative-free ingredients you'd find in your fridge, and it's delivered right to your door. It is so convenient. This is why Cats.com named Smalls their best overall cat food. Betty definitely prefers Smalls way more than her previous food, and it seems to do wonders for her fur. She has some allergies, so anything we can do to help her skin and fur is crucial. She is crazy about the food. Chicken and fish are her favorites, but she also really loves the gravy. So give your cat the gift of great cat food this holiday season. Head to smalls.com/COTC and use promo code COTC at checkout for 50% off your first order plus free shipping. That's the best offer you'll find, but you have to use my code COTC for 50% off your first order. One last time, that's promo code COTC for 50% off your first order plus free shipping. The young Adolf Hitler was, at best, a failed artist of mediocre paintings. His own art collection began when he was in his 20s and 30s and consisted of a small clutch of less than memorable 19th century realist paintings. After he changed occupations and succeeded in fully grabbing control of Germany, he appointed the director of the Dresden Museum, a man named Dr. Hans Posse, in charge of gathering art for his pie-in-the-sky most uber of uber museums in Linz. That was June 1939. Posse was given the equivalent of $85 million of the financially struggling country's cash to start the acquiring. A year later, Posse had bought 465 paintings, and France hadn't even been invaded yet. A little aside, you know how I can't help myself. In my research, it was called to my attention by author Feliciano that apologists for Hitler and even some of those allies who helped to win the Second World War, I'm talking to you, Soviet Union, remind that a conquered country's art has always been a spoil of war, and thus, appropriately, the property of the victor. You know, a right of conquest. I took over your country, you hand over your Monets. I joke, but really, take a hard look at the British Museum's holdings from India, Australia, the West Indies, and Africa, especially Egypt, when those regions were considered its colonies. Or, for a particularly poignant example, Napoleon took or destroyed or lost an awful lot of German art in his conquests and shuffled that which was capable of being moved back to France for his own uses. So, yeah. Some say it's hard to call Hitler out on that score, as most of the great public museums founded in 19th century Europe are based on such booty. In fact, early on, Hitler had Otto Kummel, a big-deal German art expert, create a lengthy list of all the German art in foreign hands dating back to the start of the 16th century. Still, art professionals in the post-World War II world declared that a false equivalency. Why is Hitler the exception to the rule? Because a great majority of what he took, according to the Center for Art Law based in New York, was done so through the 1935 passage of laws which implemented anti-Semitism as a mainstay of German life. If that weren't enough, in 1938, even more restrictions on Jewish citizens passed into law. Called the Law on the Confiscation of Jewish Property and the Law on Confiscation of Productions of Degenerate Art, Hitler legislated theft, determining then that everything he took from anyone of Jewish extraction was now to be classified as ownerless. For our purposes, know that Kummel, the list maker, reminded Hitler of the Ghent altarpiece, a Flemish masterwork that had been handed back to Belgium as a condition of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty that ended World War I and had impoverished Germany to the point that it ultimately turned to Hitler for revenge. That 12-paneled piece of art is 11.5 feet tall by 15 feet wide, painted by Hubert and Jan van Eyck, a piece that combined Christian iconography with realistic imagery of, among other things, Adam and Eve. Deeply admired by all corners, it has been the subject of theft 6 times over its 600-year existence. At the beginning of the Second World War, Belgium sent it to France for safekeeping. Bad idea. Found by the Nazis, by 1943, it was on display in Berlin. I digress, but only to say that a lot of French Jews, the ones who saw the threat from Germany as real, also gave their artwork to the state for safekeeping, which didn't work out so well for them. In 1939, Hitler created a network of art experts and ideologues that controlled the appropriation of cultural property. It has a name that is too hard for me to pronounce, so I asked my best friend Emily Batcher, who was a German major. She says it was called the
Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg.
I'll just call it the ERR. Anyway, its members started in their own country. Anyone with the idea that they could keep their valuables out of the hands of the Nazis if the Nazis wanted them was out of luck. By valuables, I'm not just talking kroners or klimps. The Nazis emptied out apartments, loading up family Torahs, wonky side tables, silverware, family photos, papers, Bibles, clothes, linens, pots and pans, and toys. The people who owned the apartments had left them as they fled in fear for their lives. The Christians who had obliged their neighbors by keeping some things they valued did not, for the most part, stand in the way when the Nazis came calling. It didn't take a genius to see what would happen when Germany began gobbling up other countries and their belongings. In late August 1939, the directors of the Louvre in Paris began moving its most important pieces out of the city into a series of private castles, abbeys, homes, and hiding places throughout rural France. Calandra Caldecott, British art historian.
Not only were the Germans hiding the looted art, but also the Allies were quickly moving things away as the Germans approached and occupation happened. So the Mona Lisa actually moved 6 times between different chateaux in the French countryside, almost being chased.
The Mona Lisa had her own room in one of those stately homes for a time. The Winged Victory, a colossal 18-foot-tall sculpture, was the last piece to make it out during the Grand Evacuation. It was gone by September 3, 1939, the day that the German demand for French surrender expired. So, on June 14, 1940, when the Germans took Paris, the Louvre was already pretty darn empty, which pissed off Hitler. A few months later, the dictator decreed that all confiscated art be sent directly to Germany and placed at his personal disposal. The Nazis by then had already pillaged every single Parisian art gallery on Rue de la Boétie or in the Faubourg Saint-Honoré neighborhood, which was home to the most important art sellers in the world. Many were Jewish brokers, like André Seligman. His daughter, Claude Delibes, was very young but remembered what happened.
My father specialized in old masters, and Goering visited the gallery in 1938, before the war. And my father actually threw him out of the gallery because he knew who Goering was and what he was trying to do. So, as a result, that was the first gallery they looted during the war.
Goering is Reich Marshal Hermann Goering, the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. He's said to have taken a few chances with his collection, making sure he tucked away several Van Goghs, which were, of course, considered degenerate by his boss. The wholesale looting also meant that the homes of wealthy Jewish Parisians like the Rothschilds were stripped bare. Now, this didn't happen overnight. The Rothschilds were reputed to have acquired the best art collection in the known world. The family had, through prodigious business acumen and timely investment in railroads and oil, gotten very wealthy very fast. Because of that, they were able to acquire paintings and artifacts which had once belonged to European royalty, kings and emperors even, as well as popes. If you know art, you know the names of those who painted what the Rothschilds owned. A sampling includes Rembrandt, Titian, Velázquez, Rubens, Gainsborough, Vermeer, Van Dyck, Goya. The family wasn't oblivious to the fact that the Germans were coming. They had the foresight to move their collection to several of their country chateaus, to a friend's farm, to the Spanish embassy, and to the director of French museums, who placed them in storage at the Louvre with false identification attached. It took the Nazis a year of persistence, following leads, opening bank vaults, and systematically rummaging through their private papers and running roughshod over their properties to find what they had hidden and where. By February 1941, the Nazis had hauled away 42 crates of Rothschild's loot. 19 of the highest quality crates went directly to Hitler, and 23 of the second best crates were shipped to Göring. From a documentary called The Rape of Europa.
After Hitler, the most enthusiastic Nazi art collector was Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. But Göring was a different sort of collector than the rest of the Nazi leadership. He cared more about the size and prestige of his collection than its ideological correctness.
He was not a particularly well-educated man. He was someone who cared about making himself look like he was civilized and sophisticated and a man of culture, and that's what men of culture did. They collected art.
And the art was pouring in. Crimes of Centuries is sponsored by Miracle Made. I just had guests over at my house and they all slept on awesome Miracle Made bed sheets, and you know what? They were great. All of my guests, and I had 4 of them, said they slept well at my place, which is no easy feat in a house full of pets. I credit the sheets. That's because Miracle Made sheets are inspired by NASA and use silver-infused fabrics that are temperature regulating so you can sleep at the perfect temperature all night long. But that's not the only neat feature of these sheets. Miracle Made offers a whole line of self-cleaning antibacterial bedding that prevent up to 99.7% of bacteria growth and require up to 3 times less laundering. Go to trymiracle.com/COTC to try Miracle Made sheets today. And whether you're buying them for yourself or as a gift for a loved one, if you order today, you can save over 40%. And if you use our promo code COTC at checkout, you'll get 3 free towels and save an extra 20%. Miracle is so confident in their product, it's backed with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you aren't 100% satisfied, you'll get a full refund. Upgrade your sleep with Miracle Made. Go to trymiracle.com/COTC and use the code COTC to claim your free 3-piece towel set and save over 40%. Again, that's trymiracle.com/COTC to treat yourself. Thank you, Miracle Made, for sponsoring this episode. Alfred Rosenberg was firmly ensconced as head of the main Nazi looting operation. Now, the name Rosenberg might throw you off, but don't be misled. This Rosenberg was Hitler's biggest fan. How big a fan? The last R in the ERR, the name of the network of acquisitive Nazi art baddies, stands for Rosenberg. Anyway, Rosenberg sent a missive dated March 20th, 1941 to Hitler, reporting the arrival of the first shipment of quote-unquote ownerless Jewish cultural property to the Neuschwanstein Castle, a veritable medieval fortress high and lonely and hard to get to in the southern German Alps. In part, the letter read, quote, "The art historians of my staff have itemized scientifically the complete art material and have photographed all works of value. Thus, after completion, I shall be able to submit to you shortly a conclusive catalog of all confiscated works with exact dates about origin plus scientific evaluation and description." End quote. Thereafter, many works were also pre-marked and cataloged by Göring himself. He used a simple classification system, H followed by a number if they were to be sent to Hitler, and G followed by a number if they were to be sent to his own storage facilities. Göring wasn't stupid enough to take the stuff the Führer wanted, but he wasn't going to stand by and get someone else's leftovers either. As before, no one was more interested. It is said he was strategizing and overseeing the London Blitz when also taking time out to go gallery hopping and art shopping in Paris. Martin Bailey of the Art newspaper talking about Göring.
In some cases, he actually acquired works which were officially regarded as degenerate, which is interesting, which shows the contradictions in the Nazi system. So Göring, for example, acquired a number of Van Goghs. Some of them he acquired just in order to sell and make money from, and then he bought more conventional works, but he did also keep some for himself.
While Hitler visited Paris only once during the war, Göring made at least 20 trips there, personally overseeing the transfer of 26,000 railway cars of art, treasure, and furniture from Paris to Germany. Not surprisingly, a great deal of what was taken in Paris found its way into Göring's hunting lodge called Karrenhal, which would eventually house 1,500 paintings worth $200 million in 1945, or about $3.5 billion in today's money. I should explain that Göring insisted he had paid for what he took with him. That is specious. Some he traded for favors, some he paid a token amount for, some he said he would pay for, but apparently never quite got around to doing it, and most he just helped himself to. The ERR left no stone unturned either. Every French family that had taken pains to hide their heirlooms was hunted down, their servants interrogated, their neighbors terrorized, their servants shot, and their holdings ransacked, so that so much art and so many artifacts began to pile up and be stored in the Jeu de Paume, a sort of substation of the Louvre that was in the Tuileries Gardens. At this rate, the French would soon be without the things that made them French. Then there appeared a small saving grace. The Kunstschutz, a military division responsible for cultural protection during the Blitzkrieg or appropriation of same, was under the command of Count Franz Wolf Metternich, a Nazi, sure, but more importantly, an art scholar from a family of eminent Prussian lineage. In other words, a man who knew what was happening and decided that, within the strict confines of Hitler's edict to the French, there was a loophole of sorts that allowed the French to prevent the movement of artwork in France until the signing of a peace treaty. This, explained Robert Edsel in his book The Monuments Men, meant that Jacques Joujar, director of the French National Museums, together with Wolf Metternich's approval, quote, killed the Nazi threat against the French state collections with 1,000 paper cuts, end quote. Bureaucracies, it would seem, can be felled by bureaucracy. That does not mean art was not still leaving France, but it was significantly slowed until 1942, when the good count was relieved of duty. Still, If you think France was being robbed, it was nothing compared to what was happening in Poland, a country, unlike France, which Hitler considered vastly inferior to his own. Ditto their art, ditto the very existence of their people. The Nazi master plan was clear when it came to Poland. The 20 million ethnic Poles, over about 85% of the country's population, were specifically singled out by Hitler to be exterminated. The other 15% was to be made into slave labor. As for its art treasures, well, Joseph Goebbels had said early on that, quote, "The Polish nation is not worthy to be called a cultural nation," end quote. Thus began the attempt to not just confiscate, but to obliterate its art and its cultural institutions. Art confiscation, including works by Raphael, Rembrandt, and Da Vinci, began in 1939. It only took 6 months for more than 500,000 pieces of art that was Polish or had found permanent home in Poland to be shipped to Germany. The rest was considered so much Slavic trash. The number of items purposely set fire to are innumerable. Warsaw libraries lost 1 million volumes. Only 105 of the 175 museums in that country survived the occupation. Polish landmarks, such as historic castles, royal residences, and statues of the nation's heroes, were intentionally bombed or set aflame. The Soviet Union fared no better. Despite a non-aggression pact between the two countries, the Nazis attacked the Soviet Union in June 1941. The German military operation there included 3.5 million troops, still considered the largest operation in modern warfare. By December, the Germans had reached the outskirts of Moscow and the gates of Leningrad, where they would be held off for an unbelievable 900-day siege. The State Hermitage Museum in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, was founded by Catherine the Great. It had 4 times the art the Louvre had and evacuated a lot of it before the Nazis cut the rail lines out of Leningrad. The art held at the Pushkin Museum in Moscow also made a partial escape before it was threatened. Where did the art go, you might ask? Into Siberia, the Ural Mountains, into Kazakhstan, and into underground tunnels. Some statues were smartly buried in rail yards that the Germans used as landmarks for bombing raids, and thus were not bombed. Still, post-war, the Soviets reported that the Nazis had looted 173 of its museums, taking or destroying 1,148,908 Russian works of art or literature in the process. According to the Moscow Times, reporting in 2021, the most obvious piece of art that went missing was the Amber Room, an 180-square-foot room created in the early 16th century as a gift to Tsar Peter the Great in 1716. It was made of amber, gold leaf, gems, and mirrors, once known as the 8th wonder of the world. Apparently, it was dismantled by the Nazis in 1941 and moved to Germany's Königsberg Castle. When the Red Army retook that region in 1945, the Amber Room wasn't there. It's widely speculated that the Soviets had inadvertently bombed it or the trains onto which it may have been loaded in their march to Moscow. In any case, say experts, amber does not do well when exposed to the out of doors, so if there were any remains, they would be long gone by now. That has not stopped treasure hunters from looking. I should tell you that much of what happened in the Soviet Union and the stories of its decimation during the war remained hidden because the tide turned so quickly after the war's conclusion as the Allies, which included the Soviets, very quickly turned into enemies, all secrecy and suspicion, the result of the fierce competition to determine who would dominate the world after the war. Despite that, it's important to remember that 24 million Soviet lives were lost during the war. Of those, as many as 2/3 were civilian deaths. That still means that military deaths numbered somewhere between 9 and 10 million. As a way to gauge that enormity, the National World War II Museum in New Orleans estimates that the British lost 450,000 lives, 380,000 of whom were combatants. The U.S. lost 418,000 lives, with only 2,000 Americans lost who were not considered military personnel. Just a small note mid-episode to remind that I know what was really lost during that war. But theft is theft is theft, and this was the largest ever in the history of ever, and it's still worth calling out. Crimes This Centuries is sponsored by Wild Grain. When you're having guests over for a holiday dinner, let me just tell you that if you're not using Wild Grain, you're missing out. Wild Grain makes life so much easier any day, but especially when you have lots of people to feed. That's because Wild Grain is the first ever bake from frozen subscription box for sourdough breads, fresh pastas, and artisanal pastries. Every item bakes from frozen in 25 minutes or less, no thawing required. And now you can customize your Wild Grain box, so if you're feeling like you only want breads or only pastas, you can do it. Personally, I love the pastas. They're so quick and easy to make, and they taste amazing. Another favorite are the little filled pastries. They're straight up delicious and always great if you've got folks over who are going to be grazing. So good. The holiday season is here, and it's time to start baking delicious homemade favorites with family and friends. Wild Grain is here to make you look like a baking expert without the stress. Impress your guests with minimal effort this holiday season. Wild Grain is offering our listeners $30 off the first box plus a free item in every box when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC. You heard me. You can now get $30 off your first customized box when you go to wildgrain.com/COTC, or you can use promo code COTC at checkout. So let us move back into Italy, where the city that might have had the most to lose in artistic treasure, Florence, of course, was under the delusion that they were safe from Hitler because, well, Italy was on his side in this fracas. And they believed the Allies were too nice to bomb them when, in 1943, they were making their way north after successfully invading Sicily. Still, the Uffizi Museum moved a lot of its artwork into villas outside the town in nearby Tuscany, just in case. Michelangelo's David was surrounded by a brick enclosure in case of bombings. Florentines slept well, and they should have. By 1943, the United States Army, prompted by the leaders of this country's finest museums, the Metropolitan in New York, the Fogg at Harvard, the National Gallery in D.C., had explained to General Dwight D. Eisenhower that European culture would soon need to be protected from American bombs, dumb soldiers, and the occasional small-time pocketing of the continent's considerable riches. Though they didn't say dumb or light-fingered, but you get the gist. So, in December 1943, 6 months before the Normandy invasion, Eisenhower, the supreme commander of the Allied armies, issued an order to protect monuments and cultural centers if possible. The Monuments, Fine Arts, and Artifacts, or MFAA, section of the U.S. Army, a mere handful of men and women, would assist generals on land and in the air in knowing where those centers were and, after the fact, how to repair the damage done. Eisenhower emphasized that it was the responsibility of each commander to protect and respect these sites and artifacts that symbolized to all the world what they were fighting to preserve. From Raiders of the Lost Art.
General Eisenhower gave an order to the Allied forces to protect and respect important historical monuments whenever possible in the battles that lay ahead.
He also made it clear that, quote, if we have to choose between destroying a famous building and sacrificing our own men, then our men's lives count infinitely more and the building must go. But the choice is not always so clear-cut, end quote. If that weren't enough, he added that military necessity is sometimes confused with militarily convenient. He said he would not be happy to find that a commander had chosen the latter and destroyed the irreplaceable. So yeah, Ike knew what was coming. He likely had an inkling of some of what Hitler was doing, and he was adamant that the Allies be then and always the quote-unquote good guys, because by now, it might have been hard to distinguish who was who. Take the Parisian art market, which had most recently been controlled by art experts who were, of the main, Jewish. They were all now gone, and the number of Franco-German art deals struck between January 1941 and July 1944 were, for the most part, illegal and a product of greed on both sides. According to author Feliciano, documents declassified only 30 years ago show that 5 German museums spent 31 million francs to buy at least 204 paintings, sketches, sculptures, and antiques on the open market. They bought the stuff that Hitler liked, eschewing the Matisses, Gauguins, and Picassos that were priced incredibly low and snatched up by private buyers. A lot of businesses went on as well between even intermediate-level Nazi functionaries who wanted good art in their Berlin offices or homes, profiting off quote-unquote ownerless art, as if it had just appeared out of nowhere. And because war is a profitable business for some, the Reichsbank went bargain shopping in Paris to find lovely things to put in their offices. They spent something like 40 million francs there during that 3-year period. These, by the by, are the same people who had a contract to melt the gold jewelry and dental work of those gassed in Nazi concentration camps. The better to buy art with. If Parisians got wealthy in the bargain, well, so be it. Everyone for themselves, right? Just ask the Swiss. A lot of German obtained art was being sent into the vaults of Swiss banks with no bill of transfer, only to appear post-war in private collections or on the walls of Switzerland's finest museums or in private Swiss homes. The Swiss, by the way, were supposed to be neutral in the war. By late summer 1944, the end of the war was in sight, and while Hitler might not have understood that, almost everyone else did. On the evening of August 24, 1944, when the Allied troops were entering Paris to liberate it, German troops were awaiting Hitler's orders to burn it to the ground. He had made it clear he didn't want any of it left for the Allies to find. But his well-regarded and war-worn general in charge of the city, who had plundered many a Soviet city and burned plenty of villages in his wake, refused to do so this time. It's true that Hitler kept asking for confirmation by raging at his aides, "Is Paris burning?" It was not. One man's defiance saved not only the magnificent bridges and monuments and obelisks and arcs, but a lot of its art was still crated up and waiting on trains to be hauled to Germany. Then it was too late. A few days before the end, a photographer took a picture of Hitler again reviewing his toy-sized recreation of Linz and how his Führer Museum would dominate the city he would build. On April 29, 1945, the night before he killed himself, Hitler signed his last will and testament. It was short, acknowledging his marriage to Eva Braun, but not mentioning her by name, but it was long enough to bequeath his art collection to, quote, a gallery in my hometown of Linz on the Danube, end quote. His art collection, for the record, contained nearly 1/4 of all the art in Europe. Fat chance. The DW documentary again.
The U.S. Army sent in a specialist military fine arts unit who became known as the Monuments Men.
Actually, the Monuments Men, a multinational coalition of the Western world's top art scholars, museum directors, conservationists, and one German-speaking private in the U.S. 7th Army, had spent a year tracking every lead to find the hiding places for the art he had so coveted. This was 1 year before Hitler killed himself. The work was intense for the coterie of only 60 men, who were also trying to map out the road to Berlin for Allied commanders so they could sidestep civilization's greatest treasures, creations, and landmarks. In this limited context, let's just say they succeeded wildly, helped along by the most innocuous-looking woman in France, one Rose Valland, a mid-level functionary at the Jeu de Paume. Valland was a middle-aged, ordinary woman who was kept on by the Germans, who were stockpiling, cataloging, and shipping all that art back east. The bespectacled prim Valland told no one she spoke and understood German. She had told no one that at night, when she went home, she painstakingly wrote down the art that had filtered through the Germans' hands, how it had been cataloged, which crate it was in, on which train it headed out, and where that train was going. She braved grave danger by telling a lot of what she could to the French resistance, who occasionally cut the trains off at the pass, if you will, retaking the art and storing it where they could. It took her a while to trust the Americans, but when she finally did, she told them where to look for the missing masterpieces.
The records that Rose Valland kept would prove key in the recovery efforts.
Others helped too, but it wasn't like it was some organized search. It was one rumor at a time across the reaches of Western Europe, which was still largely at war. Because of Valland, the MFAA head straight, well, actually it was an extremely circuitous path, to the Neuschwanstein Castle, a remote spot in the rocky Bavarian Alps that was almost impossible to maneuver with heavy trucks. When James Rorimer, a skilled curator at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, finally reached it, he had to get past its ornate gates to find his way to eventually ascend a complicated staircase to find a vast labyrinth of rooms. I'll quote author Edsel here. Behind most of the doors were claustrophobic rooms with foot-thick walls and tiny aperture windows. Room after bizarre room, and in each one, Rorimer saw boxes and crates, racks and platforms, all containing the patrimony of France. Whole rooms housed nothing but gold decorations. Others had paintings crammed tightly onto walls or piles of crates. Behind one steel door, locked with 2 keys, was the world-famous Rothschild jewelry collection. End quote. The work for the MFAA never seemed to end. They found thousands of locations that had to be cleared and cataloged and repatriated to the country from which they came. Some they hardly knew what to do with. At the Merkur salt mines in Merkur, Germany, the Allies found gold that would be valued today at $7.5 billion. Many retreating Nazis responded favorably to Hitler's Nero decree of March 19, 1945, when he basically told his army to destroy everything in their path. If that was art he had hidden, then so be it. In the wake of this, Florence's bridges, designed and decorated by Michelangelo, were bombed so that nothing recognizable remained. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect, tried to get Hitler to reverse the order and, in some cases, was able to stop some of the destruction. In any case, the soldiers were happy to. They were running for their lives. Then the Nazis surrendered.
Christine Heron was 15 years old in the spring of 1993 when she disappeared, and in over 30 years there has been no trace of her.
I did know before the night was over she was dead, though.
A story of murder and heartbreak and investigative error.
He was 90% sure he was going to be convicted.
From CBC Podcasts, I'm David Ridgen, and this is Someone Knows Something, Season 9, The Christine Heron Case. Available now.
Desirous of good treatment by his captors, Hermann Goering's second-in-command told the Americans about an Austrian salt mine that held much of what they were looking for. Römer and colleague Robert Posey had already heard of the mine, but had to wait until the 7th Army was in control of the region to proceed. Soon enough, though, after the surrender, the region was to pass into Soviet hands, so Römer moved with all deliberate speed to beat them to the horde. The work at the Alto-See salt mines began with confusion and complication as the townspeople were weary. And the Germans had planted bombs within while the upper echelons of Nazi leadership fought over whether to blow up the mines for spite. Making their way past the diffused bombs, tunneling through temporary walls, and climbing over rubble, the Allied art detectives found a literal embarrassment of riches. More art than they would ever see in a lifetime of looking at art, stacked as if it were in a modern-day Costco. By July 1945, the MFAA, with the help of the 101st Airborne, pulled out 6,577 paintings, 230 drawings and watercolors, 954 prints, 137 sculptures, and 129 pieces of arms and armor. They also took possession of numerous tapestries, books, pieces of valuable furniture, and archival objects. The dry humidity of the mines, it turned out, had not been as harsh as some environments on the archived goods. Governments were quick to help them now. As soon as the war was over, it was made clear by the French government that all works that had been sold or traded or looted during the war had to be returned to their rightful owners. Of course, many of the families of the rightful owners had been obliterated by the war and, as pointed out by author Feliciano, either no longer existed or had bigger immediate concerns than reclaiming their art. Many had died in concentration camps or had decamped as fast as possible elsewhere to start over. Some were simply too relieved to have survived to worry about what they were going to hang on their walls. And many who had sold those so-called ownerless works were less than forthcoming about what pieces they'd had and to whom they had sold them, so afraid they were of being branded as Nazi collaborators. The loss of particular artwork is now well documented, so the search continues, a search that is complicated because the art itself may have been destroyed without anyone knowing where it was hidden, as the Allied armies, especially the Soviets, cut a wide and scorched earth path to Berlin. But the Soviets didn't feel they needed to comply and return their trophy art. They had lost a lot. They figured they were entitled to their pound of flesh. In 1995, when the Pushkin Museum decided to display a few of the pillaged pieces, the pound of flesh came by way of European masters Goya, Manet, and Renoir, among others. Vermeer's The Astronomer, a copy of which Hitler looked at every day in his Berlin bunker, was also found in a salt mine. It was returned to the Rothschilds, who later gifted it to the Louvre, where it hangs today. The Ghent altarpiece was also recovered and returned to St. Bavo's Cathedral in Ghent, Belgium. Poland got back Da Vinci's Lady with an Ermine, albeit with a boot print visible across her face, and also returned was Rembrandt's Landscape with a Good Samaritan. Raphael's Portrait of a Young Man, possibly the most important piece of art taken during the war, has never been found. In 1946, General Eisenhower was given a lifetime fellowship by the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He spoke about the importance of what the Monuments Men did.
In no walk of life can man fail to find richer experience as he falls under the influence of beauty, immortalized by inspired genius. Even for the roughest of soldiers, there is more of ancient Egyptian history to be felt and understood in a lonely, graceful column rising against the sky in a naked field than there is in all the descriptive matter that was ever written on the subject.
A few years later, the Met also made James Rorimer its director. Another member of the MFAA founded the New York City Ballet. And Robert Posey, the first man to enter the Altozay salt mine, became an important American architect who designed such imposing structures as the Sears Tower in Chicago. Upon Posey's death in 1977, the Belgian government sent flowers in appreciation for his part in returning the Ghent altarpiece. Before her death, Rose Valland was recognized for her heroism and became one of the most decorated women in French history. The art world has never stopped trying to repatriate what was found. The move to do so has its fits and starts, though there are organizations now and registries online that help immensely in that effort. Early in this episode, Claude Delibes, the daughter of a Parisian art dealer, spoke of how Göring came to her father very early in the war. One of his prized pieces was recently found hanging in the Utah Museum of Fine Art. The museum made sure it was returned to Delibes.
Well, I was a little sad when I began to think about returning the painting. It's been an important part of our permanent exhibits, but I also saw the larger moral responsibility. We can't make amends for the millions of lives that were taken, but we can do something, simple, return something stolen, and confer a little humanity back on all of us.
Every few years, it seems, another piece of stolen art is recovered, or several hundred. From a 2020 newscast.
In Germany, a massive treasure trove of art has been uncovered in the most unlikely of places, in a small, shabby apartment in Munich, hidden behind cans of fruit and beans. There are 1,500 paintings, including works by Matisse and Chagall.
Still, it's estimated that 100,000 pieces of art have not been returned to those families from which they were taken. In March 2024, The Washington Post reported that 24 countries are still doing very little to return Nazi-looted art to its owners. The Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany and the World Jewish Restitution Organization jointly issued a report that specifically cited Russia, Romania, Spain, Denmark, and Turkey for this lapse. The report the conference issued also noted that, quote, a growing body of evidence suggests Russian forces are systematically stealing art and cultural artifacts from Ukraine on a scale not seen in Europe since the Nazi plunder of World War II. To research this episode, journalist Amy Wilson read Hector Feliciano's The Lost Museum and Robert Edsel's The Monuments Men. She watched The Rape of Europa, a documentary based on the book of the same name by Lynn H. Nichols. She followed up with extensive searches, going down rabbit holes that varied from those on the point of war to the 38 masterpieces by Johann Vermeer. She also took a deep dive into documents from that time period, as well as into scholarly journals on the topic. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Schoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com. On Instagram, we're at centuriespod, and check out our Crimes of the Centuries podcast Facebook page.